So does this work? They started doing research on what types of shows were shown to see if they were fulfilling the obligations of the Children's Television Act and the FCC's rules. And what was found was that the good news was that the educational programs had very little violence in them. Okay, so they were looking at the 1999-2000 season, and they found that only 16% actually had shows that had violence in them. And when evaluating the strength of the commercial broadcasters' efforts, 77% of the EI episodes were judged to meet the letter and sometimes the spirit of the FCC guidelines. However, the bad news. Oftentimes, many of the shows were preempted, particularly those that were airing in the late morning, early afternoon. And most of those were pushed aside for sports programs. Secondly, although educational programming is readily available to children, it's not necessarily easy to find. The symbols that the networks used to identify the educational offerings were unclear and idiosyncratic, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And then lastly, there were too many that were considered to be minimally educational. That is, they failed to meet educational benchmarks and were unlikely to provide substantive lessons for the audience. And that was almost a quarter of the programming. So as I mentioned before, there was inconsistency in the logos. So if you see, here's 3 different channels, and they had 3 different ways of indicating what was considered an EI program. On ABC, there was a little light bulb, and it was illuminating television. And CBS, they put the E and the I on the other side of the CBS symbol for the I. And then on NBC, there was like this little balloon kind of coming out of like Einstein's head. So it was really confusing, and each of the logos were only on for a very short time at the beginning of the program. So let's fast forward a bit to the 2007-2008 season. This was actually the last report to date about the FCC's regulations on educational programming. And as you can see here, that the majority of stations provided the least possible amount of programming. So 60%, they were showing their required 3 hours, and that was it. In addition, a vast majority of the stations scheduled all of their EI programming on weekends. And what about the content? 2 out of 3 episodes featured social emotional content as the primary lesson. Most of these focused on positive interactions with others, self-esteem, or self-restraint. Less than 1 in 3 featured cognitive intellectual content as a primary lesson. Moreover, in this particular season, the largest share was judged as being moderately educational. As we can see here in this chart, there's been a substantial decline in high-quality programs over the past 10 years. And the proportion of moderately educational programs has increased, while high-quality programs has decreased.